Though it is a grisly topic, the topic of child sacrifice is not one that Bible readers can easily ignore. Why? Well, because themes of child sacrifice, prohibitions against it, the imagery of it, even commandments for it or about it are all throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testaments. Consider, for example, for Christian readers, the famous John 3:16. Used to be in the olden days behind the goalpost of football stadiums. Someone would always be holding up a John 3:16 sign, for this verse was seen to be a key to the salvific message. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And that gave involves not only an incarnational message, as it is certainly in John, gave into the world, but gave over precisely to death. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Synthesized with other references, like in 2 Corinthians 5:21, for God made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And the sacrificial imagery in Hebrews and other places goes to show you the way that this comes off, even though it might sound strange to talk about it as child sacrifice, that God has a son, Jesus, and that son is given over to sacrifice. But my main objective here is to talk more about this idea of child sacrifice as it appears in the Old Testament, more in a kind of summary format. I'll put a bunch of links, of course, to the things I'll mention below, as well as some specific verse references that you can read to see that I'm not just making this all up. There are various commandments in the Hebrew Bible against child sacrifice. And the practice is more or less, in a variety of passages, said to be something that these people called the Canaanites do. Not always called the Canaanites in the passages, but other people, not God's people, not Israel, other people, Canaanites. Okay, and so maybe one is left with this image like Canaanites were just running around sacrificing children willy-nilly, whereas God's people were commanded against that. And of course, an idea like that would provide a nice justification for trying to eradicate the Canaanites from the face of the earth, as God's people are commanded to do in Deuteronomy and then try to carry out in Joshua. I have another video, which I really like, on this issue of the child sacrifice from the perspective of John Levinson, which I'll link below, as well as this issue of the eradication of the Canaanites in the so-called Cherem. I'll link that too. But what's going on here? I mean, was this actually a Canaanite practice, or was this something like a literary, religious, rhetorical move meant to essentially tar and feather these other cultures with terrible, terrible practices and to sociologically or spiritually differentiate Israel? So I want to give you some lay of the land of the kind of argumentation that has occurred around this issue, not necessarily to tell you what you must think about it, but provide some avenues for thinking and some resources. Okay. In no particular order, thing number one, how would you know whether the Canaanites actually sacrificed infants for all kinds of reasons? I mean, granted, for certain kinds of readers, the fact just that the Bible said it, that's it. God said it, I believe it, that settles it for me, as the words of the old children's song that I heard as a child once went. Okay, but if you were looking to investigate this, what would you be looking for? Presumably, maybe, possibly, you'd be looking for, mass graves or burials of children that had seemed to be sacrificed in some way, and then you'd have to determine the mode of death. Turns out that this is complicated to do. There are no clear, unambiguous signs of mass child sacrifice in the land of Palestine, Israel, Canaan from the Iron Age. There just aren't. It's not to deny that you can't find the charred remains of an infant here or there, but just nothing that has been undisputed. However, interestingly, one place where the charred remains of infants have been found, where it seems that maybe they have been sacrificed, and this is a topic of archaeological debate, which got stoked for me recently when I saw a particular article online, is in the Mediterranean world, particularly in the so-called Phoenician or Punic Mediterranean world. This basically describes settlements by populations who came from what is today the coast of Israel or Lebanon or Syria even, going up the coast, and they took off and made colonies in the Mediterranean world at places as far west as what we now think of as southern Spain or Portugal, but also northern Africa at places like Carthage and some islands off the coast of Italy like Mozia and places like that. Here we do find a series of what archaeologists have called tofets, or burial grounds, where infants are buried, sometimes in jars. I mean, Carthage is the most famous example of this, and one of the most debated sites, where something like, I mean, even like tens of thousands, like 20,000 examples of these charred infant remains have been found, sometimes even with inscriptions that seem to suggest that, short inscriptions, but that might suggest that these infants were being given over to some deity. But okay, so what does that have to do then with Israel or the Canaanites? Well, the idea is, though, that these settlements were settled by a group of Canaanites, the descendants of people in the land there, and they came out and they settled these places. So the idea being that the child sacrifice that we might see in archaeology from these sites actually has its roots in Canaanite practice, let's say. Okay, but immediately a debate arises. Maybe it's the case that these child sacrifices are not actually sacrifices, but rather infants who died, whose death was then made spiritually and religiously meaningful through some kind of post facto sacrifice or giving over to the deity. Now here's where the realm of science comes in interesting ways, and this is why I got provoked by this article, which I'll link below, by Patricia Smith, who's the director of the Laboratory of Bioanthropology and Ancient DNA, Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, and Joel Wilbush, Professor Emeritus of Medical Anthropology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Her and her colleagues, Patricia and her colleagues, have done some analysis on sacrificed or buried infants at Carthage to try to get at somehow an answer to this question. Were these infants who died naturally and then they were given over to sacrifice, but not actually killed as a sacrifice, but just dedicated, let's say, in this way? Or were they actually sacrificed? Here's the stunning conclusion that her and her colleagues came to through analysis of teeth, right? Because sometimes if you get bones that are being buried and things that are happening in time, it's hard to be able to measure the age of the people who were sacrificed. And the age could be important, because if the ages of the dead infants, dead babies, is such that it spans a range of ages at which infant mortality rates were already high, we could suspect that in fact these were infants that died of natural causes. There was a high infant mortality rate, and they were given over in that sense. However, Patricia Smith and her colleagues showed their results that most deaths at the Carthage Tophet, for example, 67%, nearly 70%, were of a particular age, 1 to 2 months. She says that this age distribution differs markedly from the characteristics of infant mortality profiles in past societies. So there's an assumption and a comparison here. In those societies, up to 55% of infants die aged less than 3 months, with the death toll remaining high and fairly consistent for the remaining 45% over the following months. But this is not the case for the Carthage Tophet, where infant mortality is concentrated in the first 3 months and is extremely low in later months. In other words, she's saying these babies that we find buried and with charred remains at Carthage seem to be at a particular age, maybe suggesting deliberate, ideological, deliberately chosen method for sacrificing infants. Other people wrote to contest this. There's a professor by the last name of Schwartz who wrote an article denying this, and this is Patricia Smith going back and saying, no, it really is true. So this goes on and on. Sometimes this debate has even it's had racial connotations about the current populations who live in these places. I mean, people might not want to think of their ancestors or people who live in places as child sacrificers, right? It seems like a kind of slur that you might make against someone to think of such a barbaric practice. The question, though, of the barbarism, though, could get uncomfortable, certainly for Christians or for Jews or for those who read the Bible and who are devoted to it as the Word of God, because here you do have, as I mentioned, child sacrifice themes that seem quite intentional and even positive. Abraham and Isaac. I mean, God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. There's a long tradition of reading this sort of through some Freudian eyes or through seeing Abraham as somehow demented in that he would go along with this. But the command, as one of my professors, John Levinson, has pointed out in a good book on the topic, the command makes a lot more sense if child sacrifice was, at the very least, a religious idea that people understood, and at very most, something that God could actually command people to do. There's a famous or infamous verse in Ezekiel, in fact, in which it sounds as though the prophet is saying, yeah, Yeah, God did command it. He commanded it to horrify you and to denigrate you, but he did command this child sacrifice. Okay. But still, suspicion remains. Like I was looking at another book that I've used in the past by a good scholar, Francesca Stavrokopoulou, called King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, Biblical Distortions of Historical Realities. Professor Stavrokopoulou is someone who often debunks the mainstream narrative of the Bible. So in part of this like sort of not exactly pro-faith debunking camp of things, okay? But careful work, and it deserves to be taken seriously. She says that a king like King Manasseh, who's painted as one of the worst kings ever in the book of 2 Kings, responsible for the entire kingdom falling apart and so on, she says, no, there's a historical reality here. Actually, King Manasseh was actually a very politically and economically shrewd king who saved the kingdom for a time and worked with the Assyrians and did what he had to do. But his most grave sin, with which the narrators paint him, the shedding of innocent blood, 2 Kings 21:16, is in fact not merely, she argues, a Canaanite practice, but in fact was something that was woven a little bit deeper into the heart of Israel's own practice, its own Yahwism, and so on. Other authors, a more recent book on this by a good scholar named Heath Durrell called Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel. I think it was from 2017 or something like that. Again, link below. Professor Durrell says, well, really, the debate shouldn't be so much about did they practice this or did this group practice it, but really there was a diversity of practices. There were people who would never have done this and were against it. There were people who practiced maybe the kind of child sacrifice with a vow, like we see for Jephthah in the book of Judges. Maybe there were others who did it in times of distress, as in to try to seek divine aid in times of warfare, which maybe was behind some of the Carthage sacrifices at various periods, but particularly in the 2nd century BC, I think that there was an issue like this or something like that. Okay, and so he really wants to point out the different linguistic norms around describing these sacrifices, as well as maybe just the fact that we have different groups, not just like, oh, there's a big cover-up, or oh, one group is right and one group is wrong, and so on. And so I like Durrell's approach, the philological type approach, and looking for that kind of diversity. But I also like the approach of one of my teachers and mentors, John Levinson, in his book, The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son, which seeks to integrate this theme into an understanding not just of Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, but also even of Christianity, making this theme of child sacrifice meaningful spiritually. Admittedly, though, it's a hard one to integrate into one's own spirituality because it just seems so wild, the idea of sacrificing humans. And I know that there's a lot that we could say, dark things politically and just about our world. Jacques Derrida actually mentions something about this in The Gift of Death, this idea that we are constantly sacrificing. We constantly make decisions as governments and as people about who should live and who should die. And the question isn't, do you sacrifice? But the question is, whom are you willing to sacrifice? So this is a theme that won't easily be swept away.